Welcome back to PC Builder. I'm Jason. No, it doesn't matter if you're building a budget gaming PC with the Ryzen 5600 or the ultimate gaming beast with the Ryzen 7800X 3D, getting the best motherboard for Ryzen in 2024, it can be very confusing. There's so many different features, pricing just seems all over the place, and it's hard to know what you need. So we're gonna break it all down and make specific product recommendations for the best Ryzen motherboard 2024 for Ryzen 5000 series CPUs, Ryzen 7000 series CPUs, and Ryzen 8000G series APUs. If you get value out of this video, please give it a like, and of course, subscribe, click that bell icon. That way you get notified when we release cool content. With that, let's jump into it. Before that, this video is sponsored by VIP SCD Key. Say goodbye to crazy expensive Windows 10 licenses and that terrible Activate Windows 10 watermark. Right now, use the links in the video description, head over to VIP SCD Key, and get a Windows 10 Home or Pro OEM license for a great price. Pick your product license, then use the PC Builder discount code PC25 for an additional 25% off. Go to the activation settings on your PC, put in the code, and boom! You have a fully licensed Windows 10 for a crazy low price, which can be upgraded for free to Windows 11. Use the links in the video description below. Here's a quick list of the relevant CPUs that we're covering for this best Ryzen Motherboard 2024 guide. The Ryzen 5000 series CPUs, they're still very relevant for budget gaming, including the Ryzen 5500, the Ryzen 5600 and 5600X, and the 8-core Ryzen 5700X, 5700X 3D, and 5800X 3D. We'll cover all the Ryzen 7000 series CPUs, with special attention given to the best mid-range gaming CPUs in the Ryzen 7500F, Ryzen 7600 and 7600X, and the best gaming CPU in the Ryzen 7800X 3D. Note that the Ryzen 7500F still not available in the US at the time of filming. We aren't really going to focus on the new Ryzen 8000G APUs as they're not good gaming CPUs and their integrated graphics are very weak given their cost, but any board that works for a Ryzen 7600 will also work for them. Probably the most confusing part of buying the best Ryzen motherboard 2024 is understanding the chipsets. From B450 to B550 to B650 to X670, A620, and beyond. What we want to focus on is the first number that comes after the letter. So for instance, focus on the 6 in B650, as that tells you the generation of the motherboard, often called the series. Chipsets in the 400 and 500 series, so the B450 and B550 motherboards for instance, are all on the AM4 socket, which supports Ryzen 5000 and earlier CPUs, which have the pins on the CPU. The 500 series of boards supports PCIe Gen 4 speed, while the 400 series is on PCIe Gen 3. More on that later in our motherboard recommendations. Motherboards in the 600 series, like the B650 and X670 motherboards, are on the new AM5 socket and support Ryzen 7000 CPUs and Ryzen 8000G APUs, which have the pins on the motherboard. So if you have a Ryzen 7000 series CPU, you'll need a 600 series board, and for Ryzen 5000 series CPUs, we want to recommend a 500 series board, though for ultra budget builds, you can consider a 400 series motherboard as well. Note that Intel has very similar sounding chipsets that only work for its CPUs, so just double check you're getting the right one. The first letter in a motherboard chipset name is also very important. Now, virtually everybody who's watching this video will want to get a B series motherboard like a B550 or B650, as those usually have the best price to performance in terms of features. The A-series boards, they're supposed to be these super cheap boards that drop support for AMD's auto overclocking feature called Precision Boost Overdrive, or PBO for short, but they usually cost almost as much as the B-series boards, so I never really recommend them as we want to use PBO. The X-series boards typically offer additional features that most users just don't need, and as such, they're terrible value, and we don't recommend them unless you find one on super sale. In particular, there is no feature on the X670 motherboards that will help future-proof your build during its relevant lifespan, and I only recommend them to professional users who need tons of M.2 storage connections, as they can have 1 or 2 extra M.2 NVMe SSD slots. But remember, you can always get an add-in PCIe card if you need more M.2 NVMe drives later. Finally, AMD added an E to some of its B650 and X670 boards in a failed attempt to add more product segmentation into motherboards, and the E just denotes that the motherboard has both the worthless PCIe Gen 5 GPU slot and at least one equally worthless PCIe Gen 5 M.2 slot at the same time. I'll leave a link to a video where I go over this in depth if you want a deeper dive, but in a nutshell, just consider B650 and B650E motherboards to be the same and X670 and X670E boards to be the same. Here's my chipset recommendations based on your CPU. If you have a Ryzen 5500 CPU, you want to get either a B450 or B550 motherboard. If you have any of the Ryzen 5600, 5600X, or higher core count Ryzen 5000 series CPUs, then you want to get a B550 motherboard. If you have a Ryzen 7000 series CPU, 99% of you want a B650 motherboard, and for the handful of professional workstation super users, we'll recommend both B650 and X670 boards. Now, depending on your CPU, one critical motherboard feature could be BIOS flashback, which Gigabyte calls QFlash Plus just to be confusing. In order to boot your system for the very first time, what we call the system post, your motherboard needs to be using a BIOS that's compatible with your CPU. BIOS flashback allows you to update the motherboard BIOS without a compatible CPU installed, which can be super useful if your board doesn't come with an updated BIOS for your CPU. Now, for Ryzen 5000 CPUs, every motherboard now ships with a BIOS that will work with virtually any of these CPUs, so it likely isn't necessary except for new builds with the recently launched Ryzen 5700X 3D. For Ryzen 7000 series motherboards, everyone that I'm aware of has BIOS flashback on it, so you're good there. Just note that while they're at least post with any of the original X CPUs, you might need to do a BIOS flashback with any of the non-X Ryzen CPUs, like the Ryzen 7700 non-X for instance, and the newer X3D Ryzen 7000 series CPUs, as well as the Ryzen 8000 series G APUs. We'll cover this step by step in our How to Build a PC video, so I'll leave a link to it down in the video description. Mainstream motherboards come primarily in four sizes, what we call form factors. The full-size ATX form factor, a 2/3 size called Micro ATX or MATX for short, and a miniature-sized motherboard with only one PCIe slot called an ITX motherboard intended for small form factor builds. There's also an extended ATX or eATX motherboard, which is the same height as the ATX board, but a little wider. Most of you will likely want either a full-size ATX or Micro ATX board, but we'll also go through some ITX boards in our recommendations. Note that ITX boards, they tend to be more expensive. Also, the PC case that you buy needs to fit the motherboard, and while small motherboards will fit in the large cases, ATX motherboards will not fit into cases designed exclusively for smaller boards, so check that size compatibility before you buy a case. So what motherboard features should you be looking for? Well, first, we want a board that isn't going to thermally throttle under load, so we want good power delivery on the board through the voltage regulator module, or VRM for short, the little half square around the CPU. The good news is that almost any B450, B550, or B650 motherboard with a VRM heatsink, that's the piece of metal on the top of the VRM to dissipate heat, will be absolutely fine for the CPUs that we recommend for it. And in particular, B550 and B650 motherboards generally have very good VRMs to the point that you really don't need to worry about it except on a handful of very cheaply made motherboards, which we do not recommend. Next up is storage connections, starting with M.2 connectors. Motherboards range from one M.2 drive connector on older B450 boards to generally 2 on most B550 and cheaper B650 boards, to 3 on mid-range B650 boards, to 4 on many X670 boards, and up to 5 on at least one X670E motherboard. Remember, you can also buy a PCIe add-in card to get additional M.2 connections. There are two primary types of M.2 connectors, one intended for storage devices and one's intended for M.2 Wi-Fi adapters. These M.2 connectors can run at different maximum speeds from PCIe Gen 3 to Gen 4 to the newest and somewhat ludicrous Gen 5. Many motherboards now come with built-in heatsinks for M.2 drives, so consider that before you buy an SSD with a pre-installed heat shield. In addition, most motherboards come with at least 4 SATA drive connections, though sometimes if you utilize more than one M.2 drive or some of the additional PCIe slots beyond the GPU one, then it might disable some of the SATA ports. Not a big deal considering most people don't even use SATA anymore and certainly don't need more than 2 SATA connections. But if this does matter to you, then consult the specs on your motherboard. Motherboard audio. Now the audio section of the motherboard is in the bottom left-hand corner of the board, made up of capacitors and a Realtek audio codec chip. You use this audio anytime you plug in an analog device with a connector that looks like this, either into the rear panel audio connectors or the ones on the front panel of your PC case. If instead you're plugging in a sound device with a digital connection like HDMI or USB, then you're bypassing the onboard motherboard audio processing and instead using a secondary device for digital analog conversion. Now, budget audio codecs can sound fine, and they are typically in the 800 series, such as the ALC 897. More premium audio codecs have better overall signal-to-noise ratios and additional audio signal boost for front panel headphones like the ALC 1200. The best audio codecs are the ALC 1220 or the newer, but similar ALC 4080, both of which offer additional encoding and decoding support, as well as support for high impedance headphones when using the front PC case audio plugs. I'll leave a link in the video description to an Igor's Lab article on motherboard audio if you want a deeper dive. USB connections are one of the more critical features for just about everybody, especially as we add in webcams, external video capture cards, and other devices for gaming, streaming, and even professional work. USB connections come in a couple different speeds and physical types. For the rear I/O panel, most boards offer a range of USB Type-A connections at different speeds, from USB 2.0, those are usually the black USB connections, to USB 3.2 Gen 1, typically colored blue, to USB 3.2 Gen 2 connections, often colored red. There are also USB Type-C connectors, which are smaller but faster connectors. Motherboards also have headers to plug in the front PC case USB connectors for both USB 3.2 and slower 2.0 ports, and some come with USB Type-C headers, particularly the newer 600 series motherboards. In addition to USB connections, your motherboard will come with wired Ethernet. The older boards are generally 1 gigabit connections, while the newer 600 series boards generally come with at least 2.5 gigabit speed. Wi-Fi can also be built in, and if it is, will include Bluetooth connectivity, though you can also buy an adapter either as a USB Wi-Fi or a PCIe Wi-Fi add-in card to add this in. Let's talk fan and RGB headers, basically where you plug in your fans and your RGB devices. Now, the number of fan headers vary widely by motherboard, but a minimum usually include at least the CPU fan header as well as 1 to 2 case fan headers. More expensive boards have multiple headers, and each one can power up to 5 fans if you're using a splitter cable. For RGB, it's a little more complicated, but most motherboards have headers for both the older 4-pin 12-volt RGB as well as the newer addressable RGB, ARGB for short, and that's the 3-pin 5-volt connections. Remember, you can always buy separate fan hubs, RGB hubs, and combo fan and RGB hubs for as little as $10 if you need more connections. Let's jump into product recommendations, which are all linked down in the video description, which you can use to check out pricing and availability in your region. We'll continue to keep this list updated, including if new motherboard models release or if a board's discontinued, which does happen from time to time. Let's jump into the best budget motherboard for Ryzen 5000, and honestly, that's what we're looking for with Ryzen 5000 CPUs. Remember, when you build a gaming PC, you want to get the biggest, fastest graphics card that you can, and then just get a CPU platform that won't bottleneck them. And honestly, anything under $1,000 USD, at least at the time of filming right now, Ryzen 5000 makes a lot of sense, but we still want to invest in the graphics card. We don't want to spend way too much on the motherboard. That's why we're starting off with the best motherboard for Ryzen 5500, which remember, only has PCIe Gen 3 on it, so a B450 motherboard, absolutely fine, because that also only has PCIe Gen 3 on it. And I like the ASUS Prime B450M-A2. This is a great motherboard. It's got BIOS flashback on it, just in case you need it. The VRMs are good enough. You could eventually drop in a 5700X3D on here. Has pretty good rear panel connectivity. It's got 6 higher speed USB ports to it. Not really that much more to say about it other than it's $72. It just hit its all-time low price. Let's jump into the best B550 motherboard 2024. So this is like the best motherboard for Ryzen 5600, best motherboard for Ryzen 5600X, best motherboard for Ryzen 5700X, so on and so forth, up to the 5800X3D. I'm going to give you 4 boards here. We're going to go in rapid fire succession here. Remember, we're looking not to overspend on our motherboard, so we're looking to get something with good enough features, but not break the bank. I love the Gigabyte B550M DS3H AC for that reason. Typically sells right around $90, $89 right now. Can often sell a little bit less, sometimes a little more. There's a non-Wi-Fi version. I would just say skip it. It's always more money for some reason. And I like this board. Couple reasons. BIOS flashback, not as necessary. Decent enough rear USB connectivity to it for high-speed ports. For lower speed USB 2.0 ports, that's like your mice, your keyboard, stuff like that. It's got rock solid VRMs on it, can put a 5800X3D on here, no problem. Entry-level audio is only has 3 fan headers, not that big a deal. You can always get a splitter cable. I'll link one down in the video description if you absolutely need one to it. I really like this board, have used it several times, and it's an insane value. Next board up is a board I used to recommend a lot more, but unfortunately has sold out of Amazon. Doesn't seem to be coming back anytime soon. Fingers crossed it does. You can buy it right now now at Newegg instead. Remember, links are down in the video description. And I like the ASRock B550M Pro 4 for a couple of different reasons. Number one, yes, has upgraded audio on it, ALC 1200. It's got a nice audio section to it. 2 thumbs up there. The VRMs are rock solid. It's got better rear USB connectivity than any of the other boards I'm going to show you here in its price class, and that's 6 higher speed ports, including a Type-C, and it's got 2 Type-A ports to it. It's got a slot for a M.2 Wi-Fi key. It does not have Wi-Fi on it, so just remember that. And it also does not have BIOS flashback, so if you're using a 5700X3D, you'd probably want to skip this board. But for everybody else, this is a really, really good motherboard. Not a lot to say, especially if you're looking to do more of a kind of silver or white theme build. It's a good value at $99. A couple other alternatives here, because I know some of those boards you can't often find outside the US. Let me give you the other boards I would be looking for. The MSI Pro, there's 2 versions of this. The B550M-VC, that has the upgraded Wi-Fi version on it, and the Pro B550M-VDH, that has the older Wi-Fi version on it. Honestly, either probably fine. Decent enough rear panel USB connection. It has so-so in terms of fan and RGB headers on it. Just kind of a solid-ish board, but it typically sells for a little bit more than I want to pay, which is like $110 up to $120. VRMs on it are very, very solid overall. But I know in other markets, this is one of the cheaper boards you can find, and I would grab it. Let's jump into the best motherboard for Ryzen 7000 in 2024. And the good news here is that the motherboard market looks way better than it did even last year. We've got 3 solid segments here. We've got like a budget segment, starts around $100-ish up to about $130. Now, these are more cut down boards, but they'd be good if you're just trying to kind of get in the door with like a Ryzen 7500F. Then we've got more mid-range boards that start around $139, $140 up to about $180. They've got more USB connectivity, more other features to them. And then we've got the more premium boards, including boards with better audio on them and really kind of tons and tons of other features on them. And that starts right around $190 up to about $250. Let's jump into the best budget B650 motherboard for Ryzen 7000. So this is like the best motherboard for like Ryzen 7500F, possibly the best motherboard for like Ryzen 7600, 7600X. If you're on a super constrained budget, though, with those CPUs, I'd spend a little bit more money. But again, if you're just trying to do a super budget build and you're price constrained, I like this board, the MSI Pro B650M-P, better than the other ones in this like $100 to $120 price range. And it all boils down to rear panel USB connectivity. Honestly, it's got 4 high-speed USB ports and 4 USB 2.0 ports. That's like your mice, your keyboard, things like that. Other than that, these boards are so much the same. They have relatively kind of mediocre VRMs to them. They've got entry-level audio. They've got enough fan and RGB headers, though not that many. And overall, they're just kind of weaker boards. But again, they would be fine if all you need is a cheap motherboard for like a 7500F. Its main competitors out there is like the Gigabyte B650M D3HP. Very similar feature set. I won't sit here and rattle them all off. I will say this one does have an M.2 heat spreader on the M.2s. You can decide if that's important to you. A little less on the USB connectivity. They all have BIOS flashback on them though, which is super nice, even on the super low-end motherboards, to not have to worry about the BIOS on the motherboard. Another good board in this range, the ASRock B650M HGV M.2. I don't know where they come up with these names. It's still a decent motherboard. The one thing I like about this board, as opposed to the other ones, it comes with a built-in rear I/O shield. Maybe that's a big deal to you. Maybe it's not. For somebody like me that does this all the time, I kind of like that. I like the nice BIOS flashback button on it. I like the USB Type-C on it as well. It's got a couple of Type-A's and it's got 3 Type-A's that are USB 2.0 as well, $120. Let's jump into the best mid-range motherboard for Ryzen 7000. And the great thing about the boards I'm about to show you, you can pretty much put any Ryzen 7000 or 8000G CPU on them, including like a 7950X. The VRMs are super strong on them. But what are we getting? First of all, let's talk about the price. You're going to spend somewhere around $130 up to more like $170 on these boards. And the micro ATX boards are the cheaper ones. You can get full-size ATX ones. They tend to cost about $20 or $30 for a similar feature set. Obviously, they usually have more PCIe slots on them. But let's go through boards I absolutely love. 2 of these, starting off with the ASRock B650M Pro RS Wi-Fi. There's a non-Wi-Fi version of this. That's available for $129. This board right here is selling for $149, but often goes on sale at the lower price point at Newegg. So check out those links down in the video description. I like this board because it has 3 M.2 slots on it. It's one of the cheapest boards out there. I think it is the cheapest board out there with 3 M.2 slots on it. It has an M.2 heat spreader, which is super nice, has a built-in rear I/O shield on it. In terms of the rear panel connectivity, we have 4 high-speed ports, including a Type-C, and 4 lower-speed USB 2.0, so pretty good connectivity as well. $149, I really do like this board. The other board I like kind of equally, and maybe this is the board that's more up your alley if you're looking for only 2 M.2 slots, but more high-speed USB connectivity, or maybe you're just looking for like that all matte black look to it, is the MSI Pro B650 M.A Wi-Fi. Also, you can get this board on Amazon, so I know for those of you not in the US, this is a little bit easier. A couple of things I like about this board: it doesn't have the built-in rear I/O shield. You know, again, not really necessary, but I know some people like it. It does have the M.2 heat spreader on it. It's got great VRMs. It's got a great look to it. But I think the difference here is that it's got 8 high-speed USB ports. So if you're somebody who has a lot of high-speed devices that you want to connect in, not just like mice and keyboards, this is a really, really good board to pick up. And typically sells for $149. Right now it's on sale for $144. Let's jump over some ATX-sized motherboards that have similar feature sets. Now, there are just a ton of boards out there. I'm just giving you ones that are really, really good in the market right now. Remember to check those links down in the video description. We will update them as the market changes. Speaking of changes, here's a brand new motherboard that Gigabyte just introduced earlier this year, the Gigabyte B650 Eagle AX. What does all that mean? It basically has a very similar feature set to like the ASRock board that I just showed you, the micro ATX, except it's a full ATX size. It's got 3 high-speed USB ports, including a Type-C, and it's got six lower speed USB 2.0 ports. So if you're still looking for a lot of connectivity, but you don't need the higher speed connectivity, this might be a really good board to check out. It does also have that the 3 M.2s on it, including a heat spreader on it. Looks pretty nice. The VRMs are absolutely rock solid on this board. Not a lot to say, $159, so it's basically just $10 more. Similarly, if you're looking in the opposite direction, you don't care as much about the extra M.2, but you want all that high-speed USB connectivity, and you want a full-size ATX motherboard, this is basically the MSI micro ATX board that I just showed you in ATX size. The only real difference here is it converts one of those Type A high-speed ports into a Type-C. It has BIOS flashback, but again, doesn't have the rear I/O shield. Again, not a huge deal breaker, but it has 2 M.2 slots. Essentially the same feature set. You're just basically paying $25 more for the ATX size. Let's jump into the best motherboard for Ryzen 7000 for gaming. These motherboards start around $190 and they go up to about $250. And there's massive price swings on them. So I'm going to give you a couple of alternatives here. What can you expect for this price point? Well, number one, upgraded audio, typically ALC 1200 or 1220. Some of them have ALC 4080, which is roughly equivalent to the ALC 1220, which are the premium audio codecs on them. You can expect 3 M.2 slots on them, and typically most of those M.2s also have heat spreaders. The board styling, way nicer. They have way more fan and RGB headers, and there's a lot more USB connectivity to them. Let's jump into the board that I think is most consistently priced and kind of my go-to, the MSI Mag B650 Tomahawk Wi-Fi. Now there's also the gaming edge version of this, which is the same board with white styling to it. Usually sells for $20 more. I don't know why that is. I like this board, all matte black, especially if this is good for you. ALC 4080 on the audio. It's got a nice looking audio section down here in terms of the capacitors to it. It's got the M.2 heat spreaders on it. I think the board styling looks really phenomenal. It's got the built-in rear I/O panel here, and look at all that USB connectivity. It's quite a bit. It's got 8 high-speed ports, and then it's got 2 additional USB 2.0 ports as well. So 2 thumbs up there. And I think that you'll find that other than the Gigabyte board I'm going to show you, this has kind of the best package in terms of connectivity all around. $199, this has pretty much been my go-to. Another board that's kind of always around this price point, sometimes even a little bit cheaper, ASUS Tough Gaming B650 Plus. Note there's a B650E version they just launched with super cut down features. I don't recommend it. It's kind of more of a mid-range board that they're trying to charge too much money for. I do like the ASUS Tough Gaming. It only has ALC 1200 audio on it. Still more premium than those entry-level codecs, but not as premium as it could be, I think, for the price point. Still, very similar feature set to the Tomahawk, except when we get to the rear panel USB connectivity, they've gone in favor of more Type-C ports, but less overall high-speed ports. So 4 high-speed ports, 2 of them Type-C, and 4 regular USB Type A, USB 2 ports rather. Otherwise, this board, it's pretty good, especially if you're in a market where maybe the Tomahawk or some of the other boards I'm going to show you aren't available. I think this is a great board to pick up. If you don't really care about the audio, but you just want to max out USB connectivity, I do like the Gigabyte B650 Aorus Elite AX V2, these names, but 3 M.2s on it, all of them under these kind of pretty heavy duty heat spreaders. and it's got a ton of rear panel USB connectivity to it. Now, they're not all as high speed as the Tomahawk, but there's just more of them. So there's a total of 8 high-speed ports, and then there's 4 additional USB 2.0 ports. So if you're someone who has to plug all the things in and you don't really care about the audio, which is ALC 897, it's just an entry-level codec on this, this might be a good one to pick up. Checking in on the ROG Strix alternatives here, right now priced way too high, but they often go on sale, so check those links down in the video description. We got the Asus ROG Strix B650-A, not many more features than a tough gaming, honestly, except continuously upgraded audio to ALC 1220 or their proprietary version of it, and 1 additional Type A port on the rear panel. And it's all got the white styling. It's got all the Asus cool RGB. It's got some additional fan headers to it. $260 right now. This board can often be found for as little as $220 on sale. And then we've got the ROG Strix B650E-F. Now, this is the board that I own. It's sitting next to me, and this is what I use in my production rig. I will say I like it a lot. I did get it for $210 though, not $260. That's kind of pricey. But if you're somebody who absolutely has ROG Strix, let me tell you, it's a phenomenal motherboard, absolutely phenomenal. And in terms of the rear panel connectivity, it's got all those same features audio-wise and everything as its -A board, but rear panel connectivity, it's got tons more rear panel connectivity, and it's got 8 total high-speed USB ports, and then it's got 4 USB 2.0. And for somebody like me, when I plug in like external mics and cameras and stuff to do all the video capture devices, absolute godsend. Love this board. Let's jump in the best all-white motherboard for Ryzen 7000, and we'll also do the best all-black motherboard for Ryzen 7000. This is in addition to the boards we've already gone over that have some white and black elements to them. But honestly, if you're looking to do an all-white build, the Gigabyte B650 Aorus Elite AX Ice. Look at that thing. It's got white PCB to it. Yes, white PCB is back. I absolutely love it. And these boards look amazing. I have the Z790 versions of these. They look insane. I will say not the greatest on features in terms of the audio. It's just got entry-level audio on it. It's basically the same board as the Aorus Elite AX, but it has tons of USB rear panel connectivity. $219, it looks amazing. We of course have the NZXT N7 B650E. Now this comes in both in the all white as well as the all black versions of it. And those of you who know, NZXT doesn't actually manufacture motherboards. They contract with ASRock to do custom boards. So this is a custom board built for them. It's got upgraded audio. It doesn't have the most rear panel USB connectivity. Kind of feels a little overpriced at $307, but I know for some of you out there who love that NZXT styling, this might be your choice. Let's jump into the best creator motherboard for Ryzen 7000. I'm going to show you 2 boards here. You can, if you just need the extra M.2 storage, you can get 4 of them on any of the X670 motherboards, or almost any of the X670 motherboards that have fallen down to like $199 in price, but you lose on a lot of other features, including not that much rear panel USB connectivity that I would expect. I'd urge you, if you're making money from doing creator tasks, spend a little extra money, get something like either the Asus TUF Gaming X670E Plus Wi-Fi, which is a great board, 4 M.2s on it. It's got upgraded ALC 1220 audio, which is phenomenal, and it's got a great looking audio section to it. And it has a ton of rear panel USB connectivity as well. Absolutely love this board. It's got a total of 10 high-speed USB ports, so 2 thumbs up there. Other one to take a look at is the Asus Prime X670E Pro. Not that different from the TUF, to be quite honest. All of the M.2s have heat spreaders on this, which is great. And in terms of its rear panel USB connectivity, we have another 10 USB connections on it. So just determine which one you like the best, honestly, and pull the trigger on it. Jumping over the best mini ITX motherboard for Ryzen 7000, and let's start off. I don't like any of the ASRock boards. We'll keep this pretty short here. They only have 1 M.2 connector. That's kind of a no-go for me. My top choice here is the Gigabyte B650 Aorus Ultra. We actually use this board in our mini ITX build over the summer. It's $250. It has 3 M.2 slots. One of them is on the back of the motherboard. Make sure you use that one when you install it, because you will never see that slot again. In terms of rear panel connectivity, also pretty good. 5 high-speed ports, 2 USB 2.0 ports as well. They all come with Wi-Fi. They all have upgraded audio on them as well. Kind of in second place for me, or maybe if you just want more high-speed USB connectivity and you don't care about the extra M.2 slot, I like the Asus ROG Strix B650E-I. Has 2 M.2s on it instead of 3 like the Gigabyte, but it adds an additional high-speed USB port to its bevy of connectors basically in the back. And it also has those 2 extra Type A USB 2.0 ports on it. So overall, very, very good motherboard. A little hard on the price though at $311. Remember, everything is linked down in the video description, so check those out for current pricing and availability in your region. And if you got value in this video, give it a like. It really does make a difference to the channel. And of course, subscribe, click that bell icon. That way you get notified when we release cool content. And we'll catch you on the next one.